Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of Two Cooks Talking. I am your host, Nguyen. I am not an expert on cooking, but I am a pretty knowledgeable guy on food. With me is my co host, executive chef Michael Weller, who is an expert on cooking.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm sure pretty good at eating. So,
Okay. So, for this episode, we wanted to dive into more of our singular topic episodes covering a single food ingredient. This time, it's an ingredient that's near and dear to my heart. Probably a little physically at this point with maybe some of the buildup that I've had with the cholesterol and such. But I'm a big beef lover, and there's no better king of beef than steaks.
gotta be.
Yeah. So we're going to cover steaks this episode, and it's probably one of the most primal things that you can eat. There's nothing for me better than just like sitting down with a nice medium rare or even slightly more red steak, and just a knife and fork and just digging right in.
That's just one of the top experiences in the kitchen. I love steak.
Yeah.
Can't beat steak.
So I guess I don't know where we want to go on this. So if you want to go, I don't know. You're more of the anthropological expert. If there's any history on steaks that
So
you
it's
can
still a dead animal fell in the fire, and we took it out and ate it. I
yeah,
mean,
it's not sophisticated.
no. Now that being said, there are some sophisticated touches to it we get into. So one of the things people love most about a steak. Is the crust, is the outside, is the sear on the outside of a piece of steak, and so different ways of developing that cooking techniques are important. One of the things that's happening on the outside of a steak, just to get technical on something very primal, is called the Maillard reaction. It's that browning and flavor developing that happens on the outside. It looks a lot like caramel, which is what happens with sugar when you heat sugar, but this is based on amino acids. And it's that crust on the outside of the steak that forms, that build flavor compounds. So we talked in previous episodes about sous vide cooking, and I love the application of sous vide, but always with sous vide, you're missing that crust. One of the last steps is always build that crust, build that flavor. And I think that's one of the keys to cooking a good steak is developing a good exterior crust.
So what's your preferred method of cooking a steak? Do you prefer the sear and roast, or do you do the reverse sear?
So I think it's really important in a perfect world, the lower and slower you cook a piece of meat, the less moisture you drive out of it. So first of all, I'm a big person for, however you prefer your food is how you prefer your food. I believe in that. If you like steaks well done, great, that's how you like steaks. And heck, I'll even cook one for you. But I don't think we need to talk about medium well or well done steaks in a serious discussion of steaks. At that point in time, you've lost most of what makes a steak good.
Right, a lot of the nuances, a lot of the
Flavor,
of the
juice, tenderness, you name it, it's gone. You can cook it how you wish. If I'm cooking for you, I will cook it the way you want. But we're here to talk about steak, not brick. So, so I like cooking it as slowly as possible. Again, when we say steak, we're talking about individual pieces. When you're talking about a roast, that's like many steaks put together.
Right.
That's the big piece. So on a steak, there really isn't, other than sous vide, a practical application for cooking low and slow. So I'm a high heat guy all the way.
Okay.
I love high heat. I love a good char on the outside. Char adds some bitterness, which is an important flavor component. And I like finishing butter.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with steak and butter. It's a classic combination. It tastes great together. One of my first, actually, I think steak is probably one of the first things I actually really got into cooking with, besides doing ramen, doing tricks with ramen. But steak is something that I got really into. And coincidentally enough, going back to a conversation we had previously about eggs and Gordon Ramsay, it was a Gordon Ramsay video about cooking steak in brown butter, and just putting butter in a pan, throwing a steak on there, and basting the steak with butter. That's kind of what got me introduced into, I guess, a little finer cooking than ramen with a boiled egg in it.
I don't know. I am a deep lover of steaks and steak cookery, but don't ask me to rate that above or below the first ramen shop I walked into in Japan. I mean, I love food,
Yeah.
but that act of cooking a steak in a pan with butter and basting the steak with the butter as it melts and turns nutty brown, that's such an intimate act. The whole universe comes down to you and the spoon and the pan and the steak. It's one of my favorite moments in cooking. This idea of basting food that classically in French, it's a classic sauté involves basting with a spoon.
Right.
And that act not only does tremendous things for flavor, it's also just a very personal and intimate act for me as a professional in the kitchen. The whole world shrinks down, and it's just me in the pan and the food. It's a special moment in the kitchen, whether or not I get to eat that steak or not.
Yeah. So it sounds like you just do all your cooking in the pan. You don't finish it in the oven or anything like that?
Depending on the size of the piece, I mean, if you bought me a cowboy steak, if you bought me a 32 ounce on the bone,
2 inch thick.
then sometimes finishing in the oven has an advantage. Most steaks can be done in a pan all at once. I like finishing in the oven for the consistency of the product, but most steaks that we have access to buying right now can be finished in the pan, and why not do it that way?
Kind of going on that, I think there's a little bit of a change, I think, with modern cooking where instead of finishing in the oven, now it's cooking it in the oven first and then finishing in the pan, what's called reverse searing. Instead of searing the steak first, you're searing it last. Do you have a preference or?
I'm an old guy.
Yeah.
I like old methods. Again, typically a steak can be finished in a pan. I know the science behind cooking it low and slow in an oven, pulling it out and searing at the end. Again, we're trying to retain as much moisture as possible.
Right.
So that reverse process makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For me, just the way I cook, I have done steaks so long that way that I have a comfort zone.
Right.
I can be retrained. I can learn new tricks.
Yeah.
I might play with that. It makes a lot of science sense.
Yeah, and from what I understand, just because it's also the way I kind of do it using my sous vide method, by doing this, not only does it retain the juice, but you end up getting a better crust on it, just because you're letting that sear happen at the end, and you're not letting it kind of sit in the
Deteriorate.
juices and,
Yeah. There's an important and really important myth about searing a steak, though. Even amongst professional chefs, all of the time when you're listening to chefs talk about cooking, they'll use the phrase "seal in the juices."
Oh yeah.
Sorry, guys, it doesn't seal in the juices. It costs you juices to sear a steak. That's not why we sear a steak. We sear a steak for flavor, and you lose some juices in searing it, but it's an essential flavor component.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of juice is just water anyway, right? A little bit of it.
A little bit is water,
yeah.
but that moisture really helps.
Yeah.
Most of what cooking is removing water.
Right.
When you reduce a sauce, a lot of what we do when we cook is drive water off in the form of steam so that the flavor is left behind and concentrated. In the case of meat proteins, that liquid is really important, and it's part of the whole sensation that we're looking for. So if you can preserve it, all the better.
Right. So kind of describe my method. We've dipped into this before. I do the sous vide method, going back to what we talked about. It's a vacuum seal with a water bath. The water I set at a temperature of about 135 degrees, which is the huge benefit of sous vide. You set it at a temperature and it stays at temperature. 135 degrees is about medium rare. Then what I do to finish it is I take it out of the bath. I leave it in there for about maybe an hour or two. And then I take it out of the bath and dry it off. I pat dry it first, just so that I can get rid of any of the exterior moisture. Throw it in a piping hot cast iron skillet, and then I hit it with a blowtorch. I think it's one of the coolest, most fun things to do. When you bring a blowtorch in the kitchen, it's just it makes you feel like a mad scientist, and steak is a great application for it. I know there are many desserts that use blowtorches, but
Blowtorches got me into cooking desserts.
yeah,
I'm guilty.
yeah,
A blowtorch is just fun.
yeah.
So
So that's how I cook it. For me, it goes to your low and slow method. It cooks at that temperature. It won't overcook, and by using the hottest temperatures I can, meaning the cast iron skillet at the highest temperature on the stove and the blowtorch in combination, it leaves me with a very small gray ring on the meat, and that's what I really look for. I'm looking for, as soon as I cut in, a nice pink, reddish pink throughout the steak, and then maybe a small gray band. I think that's kind of what everyone's looking for if they're avoiding that
we're
temperature.
all looking for it, and a key component of that is resting,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
So a steak comes out of a pan. A steak comes out of even a sous vide bath at 135 degrees. The heat is movement, is molecular movement. That's what heat is. So you heat up a steak. The water inside of the steak is moving very quickly because it's hot. If you cut into that steak when everything's moving and all of the juices are in motion, the juices run out of the steak. You leave it settle and redistribute the juices, and you get a more even color across the steak.
Yeah, and by resting, it's when you're done cooking, you set it on. I try to set it on some sort of graded, elevated platform. That way, it's not sitting in the juice as it's resting, and that'll let the moisture redistribute as you were talking about.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about cuts of steak. That's probably the more, cooking is the fun part, and then the other fun part is talking about the different cuts of steak.
I love meat.
Yeah.
I think just right off the bat, one of the big differences, if you talk to chefs, I don't know of a chef in my circle of friends and peers and acquaintances. I don't know of a chef who prefers beef tenderloin or filet mignon.
Right.
It's the most popular cut. It has the as far as an expensive cut. It has the cachet of being that piece of meat that you order when you're really at a fancy restaurant, and it is incredibly tender. With meat, the more work a muscle does, the more flavor it develops, and the tougher it gets. So the fillet runs along the back of the animal, and it does almost no work. It runs along the spine in the back of the cow, and because it does no work, it's incredibly tender. But because it does no work, it doesn't have very intense beefiness.
Right.
So when we're talking about meat for a steak, we're immediately eliminating some of the most flavorful cuts. So on a cow, the two most flavorful cuts, to my mind, are the oxtail and the beef cheek. If you see a cow standing on a hill, there's only two things moving on that cow. The tail's moving and the cow's chewing.
Yeah.
Those two muscles get the most work. They have the most beef intense flavor, but they're too tough to be used as a steak cut. They've got too much collagen, too much buildup that has to be cooked low and slow to get rid of. So if you're looking at steaks, you're kind of balancing. And at one end of the balance, and undeniably good at what it does, is the filet of beef, the beef tenderloin.
Right.
Incredibly tender piece of meat.
Cuts like butter. It's
It's beautiful for that.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like with people. Celebrate what you are, and you're good at what you are. And a filet of beef is incredibly tender.
and the presentation of a fillet is so nice because you get a nice thick circular steak, and it looks really pretty on a plate.
It looks gorgeous on a plate. And so many classic dishes are based on it. And it's not like if you handed me a filet of beef, I would turn it in for a hamburger, right?
Right, yeah.
I love it. I will eat it up and have a smile on my face.
Yeah.
It is not the most intensely beefy of the steaks, flavor-wise. I think from there, we might go to the New York strip, where you get New York steak. Lots of different names across the country. In California, we typically refer to it as a New York strip steak. has that classic line of fat around. It's the oval shaped steak, right? Typically sold boneless, although you can buy it with a feather bone attached. As a general rule, again, hard and fast rule: the more the muscle works, the more flavorful it will be, and the tougher it will be. Again, another solid rule is meat cooked on the bone is going to have more flavor.
Yeah.
It just does. So a feather bone New York is an excellent piece of meat.
Now, going on that, it's not the from what I understand, it's not the bone itself that's making the flavor. It's that the meat doesn't cook as much when it's near the bone, or it's more difficult to cook that there, so that it will retain the flavor that it has better around the bone.
It is definitely a culinary challenge to cook evenly across a piece of meat where part of the meat is being shielded by the bone. But I also think there's a flavor element. There is a place where, if you have a bone, there's a place where meat fibers are connected to a bone. And that is different than you get on a filet of beef tenderloin, where none of those fibers are connected as such to the bone. They are a unit in and of themselves.
Right.
Right? On a T-bone, on a Porterhouse, on any of the classic steaks that are sold on the bone, there's areas where the proteins connect to the bone, and there's a connection there, and there's a different flavor element introduced because of it.
Okay.
And there's also a pocket of less cooked meat right next to the bone. The bone insulates, and it's a challenge you have to get past as a cook.
Or you don't, and just eat.
Or you don't, just eat it
the
rare.
red meat.
There we go. So on that topic, from a New York, which is for different reasons, one of my go-to steaks. You get the steaks that are actually on the bone. If you take that fillet of beef and you look at where it matches on the beast, the fillet of beef is one part of the two muscles that are in a T-bone. And so with a T-bone steak, you get a bone that's shaped like a T. I mean, we're cooks here. We're not creative geniuses. We
Right.
call it a T-bone because the bone looks like a T. And there's a small little pocket of meat on one side of the T. That's the fillet of beef. And there's a larger one on the other side. I love a T-bone because it's got a lot of bone, a lot of meat.
What's the difference between the T-bone and the porterhouse then?
The size of the fillet piece.
Okay.
So as you move up the beast, you get a larger and larger piece of fillet connected to the T-bone. And so once you start getting a significant amount of meat on the fillet side, it changes from a T-bone to a porterhouse.
Okay. Is there an actual definition grade, or is it kind of it looks more like a porterhouse at this point?
No, there are actual definitions. They are listed in the Meat Buyer's Guide very precisely. So you have two things happening. You have an active community of butchers across the world who are all cutting the same beast into pieces. And in different areas of the world, butchers cut up an animal differently. And within that world, in that culture of butchers, which is a wonderful subculture of people, you have a lot of creativity and a lot of different approaches to breaking down an animal, and lots of different names for the same piece of meat in the same cut. And so that varies wildly. And then in the United States, we have a Meat Buyer's Guide that defines things precisely.
Right.
Cut at this bone, cut to this size, cut with this amount of fat, very specifics. So you can order a piece of meat and know exactly what you're going to get. Nowhere near as much fun as going down to what I think we should be supporting in this world, local butchers and people who cut their own meat, and saying, "Hey man, can you get me a porterhouse with a big thick chunk of fillet on it?" That's the relationship you want to have.
Right.
You want somebody who can support you in that way. And there's a revival of butchery, along with all the other wonderful effects that I think really began with the TV Food Network. For good and for ill, they brought a lot of change to the culinary world. This interest in food has brought a revival of artisanal butchers. And I think that's a really powerful thing, to be able to go and talk to a butcher and tell them what you want to get. Including the next steak on the list, which is a ribeye.
That's I love a ribeye. I mean, would you say that's kind of like the two extremes of, I guess, like marbled in fat between a ribeye and a fillet is kind of what you're looking at.
Piece of filet has almost no fat and only intrinsic marbling, and a ribeye has a fat cap. It has a pocket of fat in the middle. It has wonderful marbling. Again, depending on how the cow is raised. Lots of other topics to go with, but just basic cut compared to cut. Yeah, one of the reasons a ribeye has so much flavor is that so much marbling, so much fat, and so delicious.
Yeah, and incredibly forgiving for cooking. It's just because the fat does so much for you that you can undercook it, you can slightly overcook it, and it'll still be pretty damn good.
I'm not going to push a medium ribeye off my plate. I'm going to dig in and enjoy every minute of it.
Yeah.
And it will go rare. It'll go rare reasonably well.
The fat just makes it a little tougher to chew.
Yeah, there are good things that happen when fat cooks that I like. I'm more inclined to cook a piece of meat like a ribeye a little bit more because of the beautiful things that happen to the fat. I prefer my fillet of beef rare to get as much flavor as I can out of that cut.
Right.
But I go medium rare, almost even medium with a ribeye, just because of the amazing things that happens to the fat on the outside of a ribeye when you cook it that well.
And what's funny is ribeye is probably the only cut that I don't sous vide with, just because you can just let it sit in the pan for a bit, and I like that. So.
It is forgiving in that way.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you can see the physical changes with kind of fat, kind of what it does. Kind of going to the components of the ribeye, you said there's the fat cap. That's the more inedible part of. Or wait, no, there's a ribbon of fat somewhere along the. I'm trying to gesture here for those listening.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you look at a ribeye, if you look down at a piece of ribeye, it's going to look like a comma. That's probably a good way of describing it. It's got a big fat round head and a little tail that comes off. So if you take a normal comma and turn it on its side,
Right.
that's kind of what a ribeye looks like. And around the outside of the ribeye is a fat cap,
Right.
which is delicious.
Yeah.
But it's fat.
Yeah.
That little comma tail that comes off.
I think that's what I'm thinking of.
Right, that's the tail of the ribeye. Dirty, desperate chef secret. That often gets trimmed off because customers will complain that it's fatty.
There's the gristly part of
Yeah.
it, right?
But that's the part that gets devoured in the kitchen. That's the part where the cooks and the line cooks and the chefs, that's what we eat.
Yeah.
Because it's all fat and hunks of meat dripping in fat, and that's just a kitchen favorite.
Right.
And then the ribeye also it's got a heart that is one muscle, and the fat cap wraps around with some meat included. And between the heart and the fat cap, there's a solid pocket of fat. So if you have a prime rib, which is the cut that a ribeye comes from, on a prime rib you have a narrow end and a wide end. They don't differ that much. The narrow end is maybe an inch or two smaller than the big end. But as you move towards the large end of the prime rib, as you cut ribeyes off the large end, that fat cap in the middle, that fat pocket in the middle of the ribeye, gets larger and larger as you move towards the larger end of the prime rib. Because it's an internal pocket of fat, none of those wonderful things that happen on the outside happens to the fat in the middle.
All right.
It's often left on the plate. Diners will often eat around it. So I had the experience of being executive chef at a country club for years. Every Sunday we did a prime rib. Every Sunday the residents or the guests would come in and order prime rib. And there was two members who always got there an hour early, just so they could have the first cut off the prime rib. And so for any of you out there who want to know, if you ever have your choice, the best cut off of prime rib is 2 inches in from the small end of the prime rib.
Okay. It's good to know.
2 inches in, and the small end has less of that internal fat. And it's the perfect cut. And I had members who ordered, the same member ordered it every Sunday at the club and got there early enough that she could always have it.
Yeah.
So, and it's a good tip. If you ever have a chance to pick, that's a good place to pick from.
Okay, so 2 inches from the small end.
2 inches in from the small end.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about seasoning steaks and kind of what you add to it. I mean, we talked a little bit in the salt episode that the power of salt on meat and especially steaks is very important. So my rule of thumb is I generously salt a steak for about an hour per inch. So I'll let it sit there for an hour if it's an inch thick, 2 hours if it's 2 inches, etc. I don't know if that's a good rule.
It's a good rule.
Okay.
Not only that, typically, if you at the same time allow that steak, we'll get to an exception, but if you allow that steak to come to room temperature, depending on your cooking method, that also has some advantages.
Right.
And some disadvantages. There's a really different twist on cooking steak that involves
The freezer?
putting the steak in the freezer.
Yeah.
That keeps the internal temperature low while you're building the crust on the outside.
Yeah. I haven't tried that, but it's I may try it at some point.
It makes some good sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, seasoning on the outside really important. I season twice on a steak. I season before cooking and I season after it's cut. Always.
Right. As far as aromatics go, what do you usually reach for?
My own personal choice, thyme or rosemary, and I like it in the butter that I'm cooking the steak in. Right? So one of the advantages of basting a steak in butter is you've got the steak cooking in the pan, you throw in the butter, and you're basting the steak with melted butter. If in that same pool of melted butter you throw a couple of thyme sprigs or rosemary, a couple cloves of garlic, and you baste the steak with that garlic herb butter on the outside, it's really tough to beat that.
Yeah.
That's about as good as it gets.
Yeah, I pretty much also go for rosemary. I think rosemary and steak is just a supreme combination. Those go really well together. I also take black peppercorns and I pound them into the steak a bit, just shove them right in there, and I'll cook them with the peppercorns in it, and it mellows out the peppercorns. It distributes the aromatics some, and it adds a nice little crunch as you bite into the steak because it's so.
Steak à poivre, classic French.
I didn't know what it's called.
There you
Steak
go.
of poivre. Yeah.
And typically that's done with a mix of peppercorns. Black, white, and green is a classic French combination for that, and it does. It mellows out the heat. It gives a texture to the outside of the steak. It's a classic French technique. I also prefer pepper at the end, freshly cracked, because all the nuance happens without it being destroyed by the heat.
Right.
I think it's really hard to go wrong in accompanying a steak to really boost the umami nature of it. My favorite sauce with a steak is a mushroom sauce because the mushrooms just do so much to punch up the beefiness of the steak.
Yeah.
But when it really comes down to it, just flat out, I'm not here to impress anybody. I'm alone in the kitchen, just me and a piece of meat. I'll do butter and I'll do probably thyme, if not thyme, rosemary, and garlic. And I'll put a little salt on after it's cooked. I'll slice it up and sprinkle it with some finishing salt.
That sounds awesome.
It just, oh man. It sounds better than what I got for dinner tonight. Actually.
So when you go into a steakhouse, Mike, what do you order?
You're buying?
Sure.
Ribeye.
Ribeye?
Probably a ribeye.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, it also depends on how the animal was raised. We're in the United States. If you're to look at the United States culinarily, one of the most significant facts about us, culinarily, economically, historically, we are the country of corn. We grow corn and we feed our livestock on corn. Corn does amazing things for a young beef, a young cow. It makes the cow get big really fast.
Right. I mean, you look at corn, it's like a lot of starch and sugar, and it'll fatten up the cows really nicely.
Really incredibly fast, puts a nice layer of fat into them, makes them big overnight. I mean, and for decades, not centuries, but decades, in the United States, our cattle has all been raised on corn. Around the world, that's not the case. Around the world, corn is expensive or hard to raise or culturally not common. So you get grass-fed beef. And the two have a lot of differences, but grass-fed beef has a distinctive flavor. When I ran the cooking school, we used to survey the students on which they preferred grass-fed or corn-fed beef.
Hmm.
And every time it came out the students preferred corn-fed. And we ascribed that mostly to the idea that that's
Being
what they were
raised,
used
yeah.
to. That's what steak tastes like. But again,
Similar.
if we're out and you're buying, I'm buying grass-fed. I think it's got a much more intense beefiness, and I really like the impact of the flavor of a grass-fed piece of meat.
Okay. Um, I want to do you talking about that a little bit, and we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to briefly touch on grades of meat. I don't really know much about those.
So the one you're not going to buy
Yeah.
is prime.
Okay.
It's a good bet to say that as much as you and I have eaten prime rib in our life, and everyone's eaten prime rib in our life, it's a good bet that the majority of people who have eaten prime rib have not eaten a prime cut of prime rib. Only the top 2-3% of cattle raised in the United States get graded prime.
Okay.
It's amazing, and the grading is based on marbling and health of the animal, and it is mostly fat marbling that has to do with the grade of the meat, and prime meat is an extraordinary experience. The top end steakhouses will serve prime cuts of meat. Select choice, that's what we typically get at supermarkets, which are lower grades. It goes all the way down to a grade of something called no roll, which is not graded. It's below the grades.
Probably something more for stews than you would actually.
And actually, one of the cost saving elements that savvy chefs use is you can buy a lower grade of beef tenderloin, because a fillet of beef tenderloin doesn't have a lot of fat.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a lot of marbling. It's going to be tender no matter what kind of animal you pull it off of. It still didn't do any work.
Yeah.
So the grade isn't as important with a beef tenderloin. So you can get away with buying lower. I would never spend the money to buy a prime beef tenderloin. That would just be a waste of money.
Yeah.
So, unless you're going to put out really serious amounts of cash, prime grade is probably outside what you're going to encounter. You'd have to go to a specialty market or a butcher. Along the same line, another thing that happens, another choice you have. So you have a choice of cut, cooking method. You have a choice of grade. You have a choice of how that beast was raised, whether it was raised grass-fed or corn-fed. You get a choice on whether it was raised naturally or not, whether there were antibiotics and hormones used in the raising of the beef, which is probably a different episode than today's. The other choice you get to make involves the kind of cow, the breed of cow.
I did not think of that as a consideration, but
Well, again, if we're going out to the steakhouse and you're buying, see, I know how to spend your money. I'm going to get a cut of Wagyu, which is
The
a
Japanese.
breed developed in Japan. It's also a technique for raising that involves massages and a altered diet leading into the slaughter, including in some cases beer and or the leftovers from beer making. And it's a style of beef that just as a intrinsic element in the kind of cow it is, they tend to layer more fat internally to muscles. So that's what's called marbling. So if you look at a steak, the fat that is thick and hard and runs along the outside that's fat, and it's not marbling. Marbling are the veins of white fat on the inside of a piece of meat. With Wagyu beef, one of the most mind-blowing experiences, when I went to Japan, I went to a meat counter, and looking down at a counter full of Wagyu beef, it is whiter than it is red.
wow.
The marbling is such that the general color impact is pink because it's deep red meat, but with so much white marbling throughout, it's absolutely amazing and stunning. So there's another choice you can make in picking the beef you're going to cook.
Okay. And I was gonna sign off, but then I just remembered another topic on the steak that we wanted to briefly touch on that we briefly gone over a couple weeks ago offline. But there's a controversial ingredient of meat glue. So I don't know if you want to dive into that.
I'd love to.
Okay.
Okay, so again, I have a fondness for butchers. I just do. My best chef friend in the whole world is a butcher. I love butchers, and for years, part of being a butcher is to present your customer with the best piece of meat that you can. But margins in the food industry are really small. It means you can't afford to waste things.
Right.
And for years, butchers have had tricks. If you look at a fillet of beef, you get those perfect fillet of beef rounds that you were talking about, and you get 8 or 9 of those out of every beef tenderloin. But you start getting down towards the tail end, and the pieces get too small to cut that way, and you start moving towards the head end of the beef tenderloin, and there are these 2 lobes that interrupt that perfect disc that you're trying to get. And so for years, butchers have developed techniques for folding, cutting, inserting tab A into slot B on a piece of steak in order to get a couple more pieces out of that beef tenderloin that look like the perfect pieces from the middle. It's not necessarily wrong, yeah, but and it is filet of beef tenderloin they're selling.
Still same area, still same kind of meat.
Same
It's
cut of
just
meat.
not a singular piece.
Right, they've just been creative in putting it together.
Yeah.
Well, creative in putting it together has made a huge leap forward with transglutamate, which is meat glue, applied to 2 pieces of raw meat. If you then press the raw proteins together, they get glued. They get stuck together, which means you can do amazing things and creative things with meat that you never could do before. I love the possibilities, right? So it means that those little scraps of meat that we never could use viably can get glued together into a block that is much more user-friendly. I hate food waste. The idea of not having food waste is really exciting.
And food waste is a huge problem in society as a whole.
So much larger than is actually known.
Yeah.
It's frightening, and it's a tremendous problem. And so anything I think that helps us utilize closer to 100% of the food product is a good thing. But how you get there can be controversial.
Yeah.
Jamie Oliver came out on a big thing, and there's a big movement against different methods of utilizing scraps of meat. We'll get into that in a separate episode. But meat glue enables you to glue pieces of meat together, which on the surface of it really is a wonderful creative thing. Couple of concerns about it. One, it does have an enzymatic reaction that tends to produce gluten. So for the people who actually have celiac disease or a disease level reaction to gluten, they'll need to know in order to avoid this meat. For those people who have determined that they are
Gluten sensitive.
or gluten intolerant, point of fact, medicine is coming around towards suggesting they may have a medical backing for that feeling they have. There may be medical reasons to validate that. Jury's still out, but again, my job isn't to be a doctor, my job is to be a cook.
Right.
If you don't want to have gluten, I'm not going to give you gluten. It's one of the things you have to look at with meat glue.
Okay.
Probably a bigger concern is E. coli. E. coli is a modern, decades-old foodborne illness carried by a bacteria found in meat, found in feces, to get technical, and typically found on the outside of a piece of meat, which generally tends to limit its impact on human consumption. Because unless you're eating steak tartare, the outside of your piece of meat gets cooked to several hundred degrees external temperature on the outside of a steak that you're putting in this cast iron pan and blow torching, right? We're going to kill any bacteria on the outside of a piece of meat.
Right.
E. coli first became a problem and continues to be a problem principally with ground meat. When you have a piece of ground meat like hamburger, the outside has been chopped up and the outside and the inside mix.
Yeah.
So the E. coli is found throughout a hamburger, which is why we cook hamburgers to an internal temperature of 155, 165 internal degrees Fahrenheit, because the E. coli could be in the middle of that burger, and probably is in the middle of that burger. You have to cook the whole thing hot enough to kill E. coli. We don't have to do that with a beautiful New York steak. Right? You talked earlier about bringing something to 135 degrees internal temperature.
Right.
Well, I like 135 degrees just fine. It doesn't kill E. coli. But on a whole piece of steak, that's not a problem, because the E. coli is only found on the outside of the piece of meat, and the outside is getting hot enough to kill it.
Right.
Unless you have meat glue. If you have meat glue, you're gluing a lot of pieces together. So again, just like with hamburger, a lot of your outside pieces of meat
Insides.
are now inside that piece of meat. So if you glue something together with meat glue, you've got to cook the whole thing to a high internal temperature. So you can't meat glue steak together and then serve a medium rare steak. That wouldn't be safe.
Okay, that's very good to know, because I know it's becoming a little more commonplace for some restaurants to start doing that. So
Oh,
yeah.
the amount of fun you can have is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But with all these techniques, they have huge upsides, and you have to account for the first rule, which is to serve safe food. So
Okay. All right. Well, I think that does this episode, starting from steaks to meat glue. This has been episode 6 of Two Cooks Talking. I've been Long Nguyen.
I've been Michael Weller.
All right. And you can catch us on Facebook at facebook.com// Two Cooks Talking. That's the number 2 Cooks Talking. You can email us at twocookstalking at gmail.com, or subscribe to our podcast at twocookstalking.podbean.com. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.